And welcome into another edition of Believe in Panthers here on the Believe Podcast Networks, brought to you by the fine folks over at FanDuel. Tobacco Road Sports Radio's Desmond Johnson in the house with Manish Mehta from Between the Tackles over on Believe Podcast Network. It is draft combine season. My guy, Jonathan Stewart, still out. He'll be back next week. Had some stuff to do. You guys know he actually coaches high school football down in Charlotte with Greg Olson and Luke Kuechly, which is probably the most dominating high school football coaching staff of all time. They had a conference this week, so he was unavailable. So we went and brought in Manish, and we're going to talk a little bit about the NFL Combine starting this week, and we'll get to some of the needs for the Panthers. And just look around the league as well and see some of the main storylines going on as everybody heads over to Indianapolis this week. Before we start, though, Panthers news and notes. Not a lot going on other than the Combine for Panthers fans that just can't get enough of Dan Morgan and Dave Canales. You can check them out on Tuesday. They will speak to the media from the podium around 1 p.m. and 2 p.m. on Tuesday. Those should be available on the Panthers YouTube channels. You can get a full recap and watch the press conferences there. Each year, the GM and the coach will take that Tuesday afternoon to kind of review the previous season. Of course, the Panthers NFC South winners for the first time in a decade. They'll address concerns, holes in the roster, and they'll discuss how the upcoming draft might fill some of those open spots. One of the cool things I like that the NFL has done, they have swapped the periods of free agency and the draft. It used to be the draft first and then free agency, and you had a lot of teams kind of reaching for players with free agency coming first before the draft. The draft is almost 2 months away. You get a situation where you can kind of fill in holes and not have to reach so much once you get to the draft. So it's a lot better for the players, a lot better for the coaches and the teams. The prospects will take to the microphone starting on Wednesday at the Combine, and they'll go by position groups through Saturday. That's where each guy will spend about 10, 20 minutes at the podium. They'll talk to the media. They'll address who they've met with already or who they'll be meeting with soon. One of the days to keep an eye on for Panthers, Wednesday, February 25th, 8 to 9 a.m. will be the linebackers. 10 to 11 a.m. defensive line, place kickers, and 11 to noon defensive line. And we know that that's going to be a top priority for Dan Morgan and company at the 2025 NFL Combine. Let's jump right into it here with Manish. And Manish, I know you guys talk a little bit around the league as a whole. Getting into some of the needs that the Panthers might need. Two positions of need for Carolina. Left tackle potentially with four-year starter Ike Ekwonu, who ruptured patella tendon, hurt it in the playoff game against the Rams. It's going to miss a significant amount of time. I don't know the time period, but I know that similar to an ACL, probably out 9 to 12 months. We probably won't see him in 2026, which leaves a huge gaping hole over on the left side of rising quarterback Bryce Young's offensive line. Who would be out there? I'm not saying the Panthers would draft somebody at 19 at left tackle unless somebody just fell down the ranks of the draft, but where do you think would be the best spot for the Panthers to get a replacement left tackle for this season?
I think it's free agency, to be honest with you, Desmond. You know, they are in a difficult spot because you've got your franchise left tackle who, as you said, is likely going to miss, if not the entire season, a large portion of the season, but you still believe in him to be your future. I think if you look at this draft, the solid, quote unquote, elite tackle prospects in this draft are primarily right tackles or guys who may ultimately slide inside into guards. So I think for Dan Morgan to get a stopgap guy, a veteran guy in free agency, I think of Rasheed Walker. He's a guy who's probably going to be overpaid like most free agents are, played with the Packers. If you're being honest about his game, he's a mediocre left tackle, but a veteran guy who played reasonably well in Green Bay last year. He's a guy that I would target. I think the danger that Morgan runs into is making a heavy investment at left tackle if you do indeed think that your former first-round pick is going to be healthy in a year or so. So I don't think there's an easy answer, but I do think that the wise decision would be to address left tackle in free agency for a number of reasons that we'll get into, because I do think that there are other significant needs on the other side of the ball that the Panthers absolutely need to address this offseason in the draft.
Josh Nijman replaced Ekwonu in the first quarter of that Rams playoff game. He did finish the game, but Nijman is among 5 offensive linemen that the Panthers have who are going to be unrestricted free agents, along with Brady Christensen, Austin Corbett, Cade Mays, and Jake Curran. Corbett and Mays and Christensen have all spent time at center with the Panthers and guard. Christensen's actually played all 3 positions. He's actually played – he was drafted as a left tackle, now that I remember correctly. They moved him to guard inside. He played a little bit of center as well. Kate Mays kind of solidified the line when he came in. So the line that was, kind of in flux with Robert Hunt missing most of the year with the bicep injury. One of the things that they put a lot of money into 2 years ago was kind of in flux for most of the year this year with all the injuries. So we'll see if we can get the offensive line back to where it was 2 years ago in front of Bryce Young. The other position that I'm looking at is linebacker. Trevin Wallace missed the end of the season with a shoulder injury. Roseboom is actually a unrestricted free agent, so we're not sure if he'll be back or not, though he was a 100 tackle guy last year, if I'm not mistaken. Who are some guys in this draft that might fit in at 19 at linebacker, middle linebacker in particular? Dan Morgan being a former middle linebacker himself, and the Carolina Panthers kind of known for their lineage of middle linebackers going all the way back to Sam Mills through John Beeson, Dan Morgan, Luke Kuechly, Thomas Davis. So, and Dan is chomping at the bit to find his quarterback on defense. Is there a guy out there that would be in the late teens, early 20s that might be a good fit for Carolina at linebacker?
Yeah, look, it's not a high value position, and while I completely agree that they need to address this in the first 2 days, I ultimately think that the linebacker class is deep enough where you don't have to take one in the first round. However, if Dan Morgan, Dave Canales think that's the way to go, Georgia's C.J. Allen he's a high character player, incredibly smart, great instinct, 6 foot, about 230, 235. He's got a high football intellect. So whether you're talking about dropping in zone coverage, he can do that as well. I just think that honestly, it would be a mistake to draft an inside linebacker just because they are so deep, and guys like Anthony Hill Jr. from Texas would be available, I believe, when the Panthers are on the clock in the second round. I think the most fascinating guy in that range in day 2 would be Cincinnati's Jake Galday, who's an athletic freak, who's got incredible sideline to sideline ability. There's also guys like the Pitt inside linebacker who you could probably get in day 3. And there's also Justin Jefferson, not the Vikings wide receiver, but an undersized linebacker from Alabama who isn't a finished product and does have some deficiencies, but I think could be a solid pick in the 3rd round. So I think that there's enough depth at that position where you can get a starting caliber player on day 2. I just think that there's a more glaring need on the edge, and this, Desmond, covering the team day in and day out. They just did not get to the quarterback and affect the quarterback consistently enough. The Niners and the Jets were the only 2 teams in the NFL with fewer than Carolina's 30 sacks. I believe Carolina was second lowest in pressure rate. So it's not that they didn't necessarily just get home. They didn't really even affect the quarterback. And although they made some significant improvements, I think, on defense from a macro standpoint, when you look at the statistics in total defense, going from the bottom of the league to the middle of the pack, and the same against the pass and essentially the same against the run, I think when you look closer at what this defense needs to improve upon, there's a gaping hole at linebacker, and has been, frankly, for a few years, as you know. But if they can get someone to pair with Nick Scorton on the edge to create consistent havoc, much more so than they did in 2025, I think they'll be much better off. And I do think that when it's all said and done, if the Panthers do stay at 19, that's the direction that Dan Morgan's going to go. He's going to draft a pass rusher.
Manish Mehta joining us from Believe's Between the Tackles podcast. You can find it on the Believe Podcast Network, on their YouTube channel, and across all their audio platforms as well. Join me to chop up the NFL Combine. Of course, Carolina Panthers going into this offseason in a new territory, someplace we haven't been in a while, probably about a decade, where they're actually able to go out and get things they want as opposed to reaching for things they need. Speaking of those edges, Nick Scorton did start to flash towards the end of the year. Last year, the rookie who played very, very well. The question I wrote down on here, and now I'm going to kind of change it a little bit. One of the guys that's out here around the league that's getting bandied about, that will be talked about at the Combine, is defensive end Maxx Crosby from the Las Vegas Raiders. If you're Dan Morgan and the Carolina Panthers, and that's a position of need, are you at a position now where you go after someone like that's a little bit older than your core roster, to kind of make sure you can have somebody opposite of a Nick Scorton while Derek Brown's in the middle creating havoc? Do you go get somebody like that right now, or do you continue to build in the draft like you were mentioning before?
No, I think that Dan Morgan's position will be, let's continue what we're starting now. Because look, they were still under 500. Yeah, they won the division, and they were much more successful than they have been in quite some time. But they are not a Maxx Crosby away from being a Super Bowl contender. If we're being honest about it, that's a place and a position that Carolina is, a year, maybe 2 years away from being in. And Crosby, is he still in his prime? I mean, that's up for debate. But the bottom line is you're going to have to give up significant draft capital. And, the word on the street is that the Raiders are looking for a return that the Cowboys got for Micah Parsons. Are you really willing to part with multiple first-round picks to get Crosby? I don't think it makes sense for where the Panthers are right now. In a vacuum, it'd be unbelievable. And I could say that about probably half the league, to just drop Maxx Crosby on your defensive line to boost your pass rush. But I just think, practically speaking, I think Dan Morgan is smart enough to realize that, we're trending in the right direction, clearly. But at the end of the day, we were still 8-9. It's not as if they were an 11-6 team that's on the cusp of legitimately being a Super Bowl contender. I think it makes much more sense to keep your assets, get young, cheap players through the draft, and continue what you're doing, because obviously what Morgan has done in these last 2 years has been encouraging, to say the least.
So Manish, I know you've covered the NFL for a very, very long time, and I've always called the NFL Combine the underwear Olympics, where basically you just got guys out there in underwear running 40s, lifting weights, answering questions and whatnot. Give me, as we go macro view out of this from Carolina to the entire league, what's the one thing that a team can actually learn about a player at the combine that they can't learn elsewhere?
That's an awesome question. I'm going to use an example that has been discussed really ad nauseum over the last year or so, which was Shedeur Sanders' interviews at the combine. And rightfully or wrongfully, some people walked away from his interviews not impressed by the way he conducted himself. And ultimately, look, Desmond, I mean, you take the quarterback position out of it. Ultimately, can you play? Can you play or not? And are you clean off the field? Are there no red flags off the field? Those are the things that matter the most. But I can tell you, talking with general managers and coaches and scouts through the years who have been in those interviews at the combine, that there is a lot of value in how a player conducts himself. There's also a big BS meter in these interviews. You can kind of tell, based on the discussions I've had with decision makers, you can tell when a kid is coached up based on how he responds and what he responds in these interviews, and which guys are authentic. They're genuine in their responses, and if they don't know something, they'll tell you they don't know it. They won't try to kind of BS their way through it. It's kind of like in any walk of life. When you have a job interview, I think savvy employers realize who's fully prepared, who kind of understands the company, understands what value they bring to the company, versus people who just say what they think the employer wants to hear. And that's the one big takeaway from the combine. The numbers are great, the 40 times and the vertical leaps and the 3-cone drill and things of that nature. All that stuff is well and good, but there's so much value in the interview process. I can't tell you how many times general managers have told me, I really like the player, and I'm not going to knock him too much based on the interview, but I just came away from the conversation not impressed. And I'm not talking about being book smart or anything like that. There's just a way of dealing with people and talking to people that sometimes can score you important points in the interview process. And sometimes you can walk away if you're a coach and say, you know what, I don't want to coach this guy. I just got a bad feeling. Maybe they're ultimately proven wrong. Who knows? But there's just a lot of value in the face-to-face time with these prospects. And I think more than anything, that's what the coaches and the scouts and personnel people value the most during this upcoming week.
Manish Mehta joining us here from Between the Tackles, podcast co-host over on the Believe Podcast Network. Go check them out each week for Around the League coverage. I want to go out to Around the League real quick while I have you here. Sorry, I hit my microphone line there. Talking about the combine, we were talking about this off camera. I came across this article in Athletic earlier this week where this guy's been keeping tabs of like the quote unquote freaks of the combine. These are the guys that run a 4.240 or lifting 600, from the bench, like just crazy stuff. And then like you may or may not hear from them, once they're in the league. I think Calvin Johnson made this list back once upon a time back in the day. This is kind of reserved for the guys that are doing like really freaky stuff. Is there anybody in this draft that's going to be a first round pick that you would consider one of the freaks of this combine that might pop some eye-popping numbers here by the time we get to the end of this week and some of the stuff they might do?
Yeah, there's one who actually I think would be great for the Panthers. I don't ultimately think they're going to go in this direction, but the Oregon tight end Kenyan Sadiq is unbelievable when you look at his frame. He's super muscled up. For a tight end, 6'3", about 240, incredible blocker. Kind of move him anywhere along the line of scrimmage. But when you look at some of the testing, vertical, 40-yard, things that are specific to the combine, I think he's going to do exceptionally well. He's a guy who, by the time the draft rolls around, you never know. On February 24th, I kind of look at him as a mid first round pick, perhaps in the bottom third of the first round. But by the time the draft actually rolls around in a couple months, you could see him closer to 10. What I think is very intriguing about him, when you kind of link him back to the Panthers, for example, the Panthers, I think, want to surround Bryce Young with more weapons. You saw what Ted McMillan could do for Bryce Young's development. And I know they've got other wide receivers, young wide receivers, who they still believe in. But Sadiq, to me, would be an incredible addition to Carolina. Ultimately, I don't think they're going to draft a tight end. And when you look at the tight ends in the last couple of years who have made immediate impacts, Brock Bowers comes to mind. I'm not saying that Sadiq is Brock Bowers because I don't think he is. And there have been some concerns with drops, which I think will be a cautionary tale for some teams. But just athletically, the fact that you can move him anywhere in the formation, and if you do put him in line, he's not going to, be a weak link in the run game. He can do both of them. I think he's an intriguing prospect. I think he's a guy that if you watch college football, you already kind of know about him. But if you don't, I think by the end of the week, you'll certainly be impressed because his name is going to be mentioned a lot because of how athletically gifted he actually is.
And that name has popped up multiple times on this podcast over the past couple of weeks and really the season because, of course, Jonathan Stewart's an Oregon Duck. So he's been peppering that in there. It feels like we've drafted a tight end the past couple of drafts in a row. I know Jatavian Sanders came from Texas a couple of years ago. They drafted the kid from Notre Dame mid-round last year. And they already had Tommy Tremble on the roster, who I believe also came from Notre Dame. So there's 3 tight ends on the roster. However, if the one thing Dan Morgan proved last year in the draft to me was that expect the unexpected. Because I was one of the guys that was on the other side of the argument of there's no way he's going to draft a wide receiver. We just traded up to get in the first round of the draft one last year. Right. We need defense. Dan Morgan's a defensive guy. There's just no way they're going to draft Ted McMillan. And there was a segment of Panther fans online who were like, they're going to draft Ted McMillan. If they're not, we're going to riot, all this other stuff. And then draft night comes and they draft Ted McMillan. And it was like the biggest smokescreen. They gave no indication that they were going to draft Ted McMillan. In fact, they were kind of saying the other way, that they were going to, defense is priority, blah, blah, blah. In actuality, though, for where they were picking in the top 10, I'm kind of a guy where I'm like, if you're going to pick in the top 10 overall, you probably need to pick somebody who's going to touch the ball or like it's going to affect the game. Someone that's going to potentially be a game changer. So I can understand them going after Ted there. At 19, I feel like now you're starting to talk about, you're still talking about someone that should be a starter because it's a first round pick, but you're talking about someone that's probably going to affect the game in a different way, defensively or however way that may be. Now, Dan Morgan is also one of these guys that likes to move up and down the board too. So is there a prospect out there that would be the best fit for Carolina in the top 10 that Dan Morgan might want to trade up and go get? Is there someone out there that you're like, that would be a good fit for the Panthers, but I just don't know if they want to move up 9 spots to go get him or whatnot?
Well, it's funny that you said last year was a complete smokescreen, because if you listen to Morgan And as of this recording, he has not spoken in Indianapolis, but after the season, he talked about how they need to affect the quarterback more and how they need to get to the quarterback, which would lead you to think they're going to draft an edge or a pass rusher. Maybe that's a smokescreen. I don't really think so. What I think is interesting about Morgan is that, defensive player, linebacker, great college player, Philadelphia native like myself. So I know him back when he was a teenager. 4 of the 6 players that he has drafted in the premium rounds, which is first 3 rounds, essentially top 100. And I'm including Jatavian Sanders because he was the 101 overall pick. So he's essentially a top 100 pick. So of those 6 players that fit that category, top 100, 4 of those 6 have been offensive skill position players. Only 2 have been on defense. And if you even stretch it back a few years when he was the assistant general manager under Scott Fitterer, in that 5-year window, there have been 15 players drafted in the top 100 or 101, and 9 of those 15 have been offensive players. So he's really leaned on the offensive side of the ball. So, past results aren't indicative of future results. We know that. But if you're asking me who he could make a move up for, if it's offense, I would say Sadiq. Yeah. I don't think that's going to happen. But if they did make an aggressive play where they're giving up draft capital to move up, I would say they would take their best available pass rusher. And there's 2 guys from Miami. Reuben Bain Jr. is the guy from Miami who I think fits that target zone, 10, 12, some, maybe when it's all said and done, he gets taken inside the top 10, but he's a player who can affect the quarterback, get to the quarterback. I just don't know if the price is worth it, because if you talk to talent evaluators across the league, his teammate, Akeem Messidor, is arguably a better pass rusher or more polished pass rusher. The downside with him is that he's going to be 25 years old when the season starts. So as a general manager, do you really want to draft a guy who's going to be 25 as a rookie, knowing that if you're going to pay him in his second contract, that's usually the big payday, he's going to be creeping up on 30. So that's kind of the big question for anyone who wants to draft Messidor. But if you're asking me who they would move up for, I would be stunned if they did move up if it wasn't going to be for an edge pass rusher who they think is going to be a dynamic game changer. And they're not going to be able to get Arvil Reese or David Bailey. Those are the 2 top guys. They're going to probably be top 5, top 7 picks. But a guy like Bain, if they're in love with Bain, and I would say that Dan Morgan knows Miami football more than most, being an alum.
Yeah,
that would be the guy that I think, if they were going to do it, and I don't think they're going to do it, but if they did make an aggressive move up, I think it would be for a dynamic, game-changing pass rusher. And Bain, at least on paper, fits that bill.
Miami, the national runner-up, they known that defensive line was the backbone of that team. And, I'm glad you made that connection with Dan Morgan being, from the U. And that actually makes sense. That would sound like something he would probably have a lot of conviction on, and being close to the program, I would imagine, probably a lot of insight in terms of who the character of these guys are, which will find out at the combine. So learning some stuff here with Manish Mehta in terms of how this stuff all works during the NFL combine. So everything's starting to kick off today throughout Saturday of this week. Real quick before I get you out of here, 2 quarterback questions from around the league. Fernando Mendoza, Indiana quarterback, projected number 1 overall. Are you sold on him at number 1 overall? And who's the quarterback that he kind of reminds you of the most?
Look, am I sold on him being the number 1 overall pick? In any other year, I would say absolutely not. I think he's got the potential to be, a quality, solid starter. I'll say Kirk Cousins, not because I think he looks like Kirk Cousins, but because I think, he's got very similar traits as Kirk Cousins, but Kirk Cousins was a 4th-round pick. I just think it's a supply and demand situation. The Raiders, unfortunately, depending on your perspective, I'll say as an outsider, unfortunately for the Raiders, this is a weak quarterback class in a year that they absolutely need a quarterback. So I do think that Mendoza can have a quality career. I don't think he's going to be any kind of all-pro, Pro Bowl caliber type of player, or maybe a fringe Pro Bowler. But that doesn't really hold that much weight anymore, as you know.
Yeah, flag football and
I look at this draft, Desmond, and it reminds me of the 2022 draft. Outside of Mendoza being the number 1 overall pick, in 2022, Kenny Pickett was the first quarterback taken by the Steelers at 20. There was no quarterback taken in the second round, and there were 2 quarterbacks, Desmond Ridder, who has shown that he's not a viable starter in the third round, and then Malik Willis, who has shown flashes, is going to get paid a lot of money in free agency, but we still don't know if he's a week in and week out difference-making starting quarterback. So, I hear a lot about Mendoza. We know he's going to be the number 1 pick. The more intriguing quarterback in this draft to me is Ty Simpson.
Alabama.
Where is he going to get picked? Is he a first-round talent? The word on the street is that the Rams like him. They've got 2 first-round picks. They're not going to take him at 13. I believe that's their first pick. They're picking at 29. I think the conversation is if Simpson falls within striking distance, would they move up a few spots to take him? I don't see it. He's a 1-year starter, and history has proven time and time again that if you are a 1-year starter in college, it's probably not going to translate to the NFL. Recently I can point to Trey Lance. If you go back a few years before him, Mitch Trubisky, you need reps. You need reps at that position in college. He doesn't have a particularly strong arm. He's played basically the lion's share of his snaps in shotgun, not particularly a good deep ball thrower. And by the way, he was dealing with a lot of nagging injuries in the second half of his only season as a starter. I'm not sold on him. I'm not sold on Nussmeier. Carson Beck is an older player who's an interesting guy that you might want to take in the mid to late rounds, but I would not be surprised outside of Simpson, who I think will be a day 1 or day 2 pick. I wouldn't be surprised if there's only 2 quarterbacks taken through the first 3 rounds of the draft.
Wow. And comparing that to that draft from a few years back where we only had the 1 Kenny Pickett drafted, and it feels like that kind of draft. It doesn't feel like a quarterback heavy draft at all. It feels like a lot of those quarterbacks are next year, Arch Manning and those kind of guys. So some of these quarterback needy teams, the Steelers come to mind. The Raiders, I assume, are going to pick Mendoza number 1 overall, but I don't know. I don't know if he's the answer either. Like Indiana just had like the Cinderella. I don't want to call it Cinderella because it's really 2 years worth of them just beating the brakes off of everybody. I want to give them their credit. Like they're going off this run where it was so unexpected, and for this kid to kind of emerge as like the face of it all, I think it's pushed him towards this number 1 pick. And I do think Las Vegas is going to pick him number 1 overall. Is it the right thing to do? I have no idea. I don't know if it's going to be the right thing or not. So.
It's interesting because I don't think. There's always teams that are going to call and say, hey, what's it going to take to get the number 1 overall pick? Quarterback needy teams. The Jets come to mind. They're right behind at 2. The Jets are picking 2nd and 16th. And I don't think they're taking a quarterback with either of those picks, certainly not at 2. But I don't think if Simpson was there at 16 that he would be off the board. I just think it's the luck of the draw. As you said, next year, Archman is coming out. You got Dante Moore will have 1 more year of experience. He's rough around the edges right now. Who knows what he'll be a year from now. And there's a handful of other guys who will be first-round caliber quarterbacks. So I don't think there's a mad rush to trade up for the number 1 overall pick, which, again, puts the Raiders in a precarious position. Ultimately, look, they're going to take Mendoza, and I don't think he's going to be a bust by any stretch. I just don't think that you're going to, see any kind of dynamic, game-changing presence at the position from him, over the next 5-10 years.
We do got to get out of here. Before we do, though, quick word from our friends over at FanDuel. The NCAA basketball national championship odds are out right now. Michigan has the greatest odds to win it all at plus 370, followed by Duke at plus 450, Arizona at plus 500, and then Florida at plus 1,000, along with Houston at plus 1,000. We just saw 4 of those teams play against each other over the past weekend. You can go over to sportsbook.fanduel.com, place your wagers now on that, and enjoy the winnings, enjoy everything as we get closer and closer to March Madness. And you can do that with our friends over at FanDuel. For Manish Mehta, go check out the Believe in Tackles podcast over on Believe Podcast Network. Rate and subscribe the Believe YouTube channel. You can catch that. And of course, you can catch Believe in Panthers when we come through. I should be reunited with Stu next week. I believe we've got Joe DeLeon on from Believe that's going to help us a little bit more, a deeper dive into free agency and some of the guys coming in from college. That he'll be able to evaluate. He's at the combine this week, matter of fact, which is why we moved some things around. So we'll have on Joe next week to talk about his his thoughts from the combine, and we'll just kind of get you ready as we get into free agency deeper and deeper here. So for Manish Mehta, this is Desmond Johnson. You've been watching and listening to the Believe in Panthers podcast here on Believe Podcast Networks. Everybody keep pounding.